by the Honorable Bainbridge Colby of New York City, who is speaking under the auspices of the no third-term Democrats of Illinois. In public demand, Mr. Colby will repeat the address he delivered at the Union League Club of Chicago over another network last Wednesday under the auspices of that club's America Wake Up Crusade. Mr. Colby is a Democrat and was Secretary of State in President Wilson's cabinet after the close of the World War, and during the war was a member of the American mission to the Inter-Allied Conference at Paris. Mr. Colby.
To such of my radio listeners as chanced to hear me a few days ago speaking from the Union League Club of Chicago under the auspices of its America Wake Up Crusade, what I say tonight may have some suggestion of repetition. It is more truly, however, only emphasis and re-emphasis of facts so vital to the rescue of our nation that they cannot be, at this crucial pass in our history, too much emphasized. The campaign is over. In a few hours, the final words will have been spoken, and on earth, the American people will retire to consider. Was ever such an issue confided to our people for their decision before? It is a temptation in the mounting excitement of a campaign to fall into exaggeration. Superlatives. I shall try to avoid this. The deeper and stronger one's feelings, perhaps the more he should be on guard against overstatement. But I say to you, my friends, in all sobriety of judgment, speaking to you as a man whose years entitle him to claim more than mere maturity of opinion, and as a result of the closest and most anxious observation of the course of our government in Washington for the last 7.5 years, I firmly believe that we have never been in a more critical time in the nation's history. The fate of the United States which Washington founded, which Jefferson nourished and instructed, which Lincoln preserved and carried to safety through the awful crisis of a civil war, the fate of the United States of America hangs in the balance at this moment. The theory upon which we were called into being as a great republic is challenged by heedless, reckless men who have engineered themselves into positions of influence and authority far beyond any virtue they possess and far beyond any justification in their lives or records. The principles upon which our national life has been built are ignored and assailed by them. Noble traditions, exemplified by the words and actions of our greatest men, and honored by observance for a century and a half, are treated with open contempt. Theories of social organization are crowded upon our acceptance, which have nothing to commend them except uniform failure wherever they have been tried. Freedom and individual enterprise, in which Americans have always gloried and under which they have grown great, are sought to be discredited. Little men of twisted brains and feeble energies, with the venom of weakness and defeat, unable to keep step with the natural vigor of America, have tried to cover up their inferiority by infecting this great country with their own infirmities of mind and character. This sinister army of human discards has edged into positions of prominence and public authority with disastrous results to the fair structure of our industry and commerce. Their evil designs and maladministration of the government for 7.5 years are now evident to all men. Something must be done, and it must be done now, if the grasp of these pestilent and evil men on the throat of the nation is to be broken. This is the work of rescue for which every right-minded American has dedicated himself. And the result of this campaign will show whether it is to succeed or fail. At the beginning of the campaign, I publicly expressed the belief that the third term would be its overshadowing issue. Why? Because every other major issue is wrapped up in it and will be decided as the people vote on the third term issue. Is the question which is uppermost in the popular mind the fear of involvement in a foreign war? The observance of the tradition against a third term will take the decision out of the hands of a headstrong and perhaps an already committed administration. and place it where it belongs, in the hands of the American people, is the question whether to persist in economic courses which have sapped the nation's strength and failed to justify themselves by results, or, on the other hand, to have done with them for the sake of recovery and survival. A third term for the President will rivet the evil economic practices of his administration upon the people and substitute in their hearts the resignation of despair or the natural impulse to resist and to overcome errors. Or is the question how we can best serve the principle of democratic self-government in a world formidably united for its suppression and predicting its overthrow? Certainly not by turning a deaf ear to the solemn warnings of the great men who laid the foundations of our strength as a nation, not by ignoring the precedent established by Washington of declining a further nomination after he had served 2 terms as president, not, if we are members of the Democratic Party, by ignoring the words and example of Thomas Jefferson, the founder and patron saint of that party, and the greatest philosopher and teacher of democratic principles who has ever lived. The negligible integrity of Washington was unable even to imagine or envisage the possibility of the thing we are witnessing at the present time, in President Roosevelt's covetous reach for a 3rd term, in violation of a precedent which has continued without breach since the nation's founding. There cannot, in my judgment, said Washington, be the least danger that the President will, by any practicable intrigue, ever be able to continue himself 1 moment in office, much less perpetuate himself in it, but in the last state of corrupted morals and political depravity. Those are Washington's very words. Jefferson went even further and declared that should a president consent, he could not conceive of him actually seeking and conspiring to obtain a 3rd term. Should he even consent to be a candidate for a 3rd election, said Jefferson, I trust he would be rejected. Presidents Madison, Monroe, Jackson, Cleveland, and Wilson adhered to the salutary precedent of a no 3rd term and expressed, as did every president in our history, strong concurrence in the reasoning which supports it. The words of Grover Cleveland are particularly worthy of recalling in the light of conditions presented by the 3rd term candidacy of President Roosevelt. Cleveland warned against the power of the patronage at a president's disposal in forcing his renomination and election, mentioning among the pitfalls in the pathway of a president inflamed by an over-vaulting ambition, the allurements of power, the temptation to retain public place once gained, and more than all, the availability which his party finds in an incumbent whom a horde of office holders support with a zeal born of benefits received and the hope of favors to come. All this power and influence, magnified and swollen beyond anything that has ever been known, we now see unleashed, shamelessly pressed into service, and openly exploited in the effort of the present incumbent to keep himself in the office of president for a 3rd term. But no longer are the grievous consequences which flow from unlimited eligibility of a president for re-election subject for mere hypothetical discussion. We are confronted by them in their most concrete and repulsive form. A danger which has hitherto been seen only as a dread possibility has actually overtaken and enveloped us. Thanks to Franklin Roosevelt, we now know just what happens when a president proceeds to violate the historic tradition against a 3rd term. He has furnished us with a diagram and working model of the 3rd term issue in all its horrid and repellent aspects. We now see it entire for ourselves and in full operation. This is no small service. It constitutes probably a greater contribution to the case against a 3rd term than even the grave and trenchant warnings uttered by Washington and Jefferson and Jackson. by his course as president candidate, prior convention at Chicago, his direction of its proceedings, his willingness to be spattered by the muck of mechanized spontaneity and engineered ovation, and his undignified make-believe as a drafted nominee, he has built a perfect illustration of every evil inherent in a third-term candidacy. Latterly, under perhaps a premonition of defeat, he has given further revelation of his false and possessive conception of his office, as in his recent reference to the ambassador of the United States to England as my ambassador. We shall no doubt soon be called on to accustom ourselves to my government, my army, my draft, my office, not the presidency, which I occupy for a limited term by the grace and through the suffrages of the American people. Jefferson could only warn us against such abuses. Mr. Roosevelt has provided these warnings with point and actuality by supplying the very abuses in their most aggravated form. Almost sacred as the tradition against a third term has come to be regarded, it is something far more than a tradition. It has become by universal concurrence a part of our Republican system of government, and both the Senate and the House of Representatives have repeatedly declared that any departure from it would be unwise and fraught with peril to our free institution. It has acquired morally the force of a constitutional limitation and the validity of positive law. The little abject creatures of the New Deal who say yes for hire have been hard put to dodge the third-term issue. They have taken the position that the historic tradition against it is only an attitude of mind, a sort of habit in which we have long persisted, but which can be interrupted or continued, as may accord with our momentary state of feeling, without much consequence either way. This is a tragic mistake. A third-term candidacy with its abuse of presidential power is an affront to the national conscience and violates a basic principle which runs through the body of our law. I refer to the accountability of elected officials to the people at reasonably short and recurring intervals of time. This is the means we have established to secure our citizens in the control of their government. Anything which weakens this control vested in the people or disturbs, balks, or falsifies a free expression of their judgment and choices, either in the election of candidates or their nomination at party convention, is a blow aimed at democratic government. Our government is not built upon the theory that the power with which we clothe an elective official shall be thrown into the scales of a political contest to be exercised in his own interest and to ensure his retention in office. Indefinite tenure of a public office enables the incumbent to dig in and resist dislodgement. This is something the people will not tolerate. The tendency of the presidential office to gather power is perfectly understood by the people. The power to influence legislation, to sway judicial decisions, the power of appointment to remunerative office, the personal and unchecked discretion of the president in the expenditure of the public revenues, the power to initiate policy, the power to determine the solemn issue of peace or war, and even the future and the destinies of the nation are in the keeping of a president, but, and this is something presidents may forget, but the people never. But, I say, subject to an accountability to the people for their faithful and proper use. Such use does not embrace their employment for the self-perpetuation of a president in an office he is too enamored of to relinquish, nor does it include the employment of the powers of his office to defeat the free expression of the popular will in the choice of his successor. As a great student of our history, de Tocqueville once said, "A candidate who is not the president seeking the presidency is but an individual, while the president seeking renomination is the state itself." intriguing and corrupting with its immense resources. The only protection the people have against such a condition is the limitation of the president's tenure of his office. Rotation in office, Thomas Jefferson called it. The dation of the tradition against the third term, and as Senator Hiram Johnson put it in his epic speech a little more than a week ago, no could be presented to the people of the United States which so vitally affects their liberty or the future of free institutions in the world. It is one of the traditions of American life that the right man to meet a crisis always emerges from our people. Not a self-styled, indispensable man, but from the vast reserves of conscience and ability which the free institutions of America so richly nurture, there is sure to arise a man competent and equal to the stern demands of his country's needs. Thomas Jefferson, whom the English regarded as a Virginia backwoodsman, drafted the stirring remonstrance to the king against the injustice to which the crown was subjecting the colonists, and later was the author of the Declaration of Independence. Washington, the obscure land surveyor in the wilderness of Virginia, stepped modestly and naturally into the chief command of the Revolutionary Army and won undying fame, both on the field of battle and in the halls of statesmanship. Lincoln, the humble lawyer in rural Illinois, of little education except that which he had gained by his own exertions and sacrifices, held the country steady in the terrible ordeal of the Civil War and brought us through that agony a united and strengthened people.